1953, in Harlan County, Kentucky, a wooden table that once had enough room for 6 people now held only one bowl, set neatly beneath the yellow light. On the stove, the small enamel pot began to warm, just enough for dinner and the next day's lunch. Beside it were a can of tomatoes, half a cup of rice, 1 onion, and a recipe card with softened corners. The number 6 had been crossed out in pencil and changed to the number 2. Outside the window pane, it had grown completely dark. In the kitchen, the flame burned low, and hot tomato steam mingled with the smell of softened onion and swelling starch. It was the smell of a home still being cared for. The one-pot dish in those kitchens was a way to preserve strength, save the next meal, keep the table from becoming cold and lonely. In tonight's recipe box, there are tomatoes with rice, a quick-cooked egg dish, a pot of beans waiting beside the wash basin, soup made from chicken backs and necks, a recipe card from 1933, and the number 1 dish that speaks most clearly to the meaning of taking care of oneself. If these kitchens remind you of someone who once cooked from the memory of their hands, subscribe to Old American Kitchen. The recipe box has opened, and 25 dishes begin in South Philadelphia. Canned tomatoes, eggs, and meals that do not cure. Standing for long in 1960, in a row house in South Philadelphia, the large pot that had once cooked for 5 people was pushed deep into the lower cabinet. She kept the smallest enamel pot, the kind just big enough to hold 1 can of tomatoes, 2 eggs, 2 servings of oatmeal. The children had moved out. The sound of chairs being pulled around the table grew less frequent, but every evening, the tablecloth was still shaken out and smoothed flat. The recipe box sat near the edge of the table, holding cards whose corners had softened from steam and damp hands. From here, the first 4 dishes began with one very small thing: less standing, less washing. The bowl still had to be hot. Dish number 25, tomato soup with rice. The smell of hot tomatoes clung to the curtain near the stove before the grains of rice had time to swell. In 1960, in South Philadelphia, short-grain rice cost about 18 to 19 cents per pound, and canned tomatoes cost about 16 cents per pound. With half a cup of rice, 1 can of tomatoes, and half an onion, she could make a pot of soup for 2 meals for about 25 to 30 cents. The hand-crank can opener clicked, the tomatoes slid into the pot, and then the wooden spoon pressed each soft piece against the enamel side. Rice, onion, salt, and water all went in at the same time. When the pot came to a boil, she stirred along the bottom, lowered the heat, and set the lid slightly askew. 20 minutes later, the thin red liquid turned lightly cloudy, and starch clung around the face of the spoon. At noon the next day, she added a little water, reheated it slowly, and that one could still keep the kitchen going. Dish number 24, edge drops up. Some evenings, her strength ran so low that even the sound of a pan felt heavy. Then she took the leftover broth, poured it into the small enamel pot, and waited for the surface of the liquid to tremble gently. In 1960, a dozen regular eggs cost about 63 cents, so 2 eggs came to only about 10 cents. If the broth had already been made the day before, this meal cost about 10 to 15 cents, including a little salt, pepper, and the leftover scallions. The eggs were cracked into a cup and beaten with a fork until just blended. She stirred the broth into a slow circle, then poured the eggs through the tines of the fork in a thin stream. Yellow ribbons appeared the moment they touched the hot water, as thin as strips of cloth in the steam. The pot was lifted off the stove before the eggs became tough. 4 minutes on the stove was still a way of caring. Number 23, oatmeal with apples. Before the light reached the window pane, the spoon was already scraping softly along the bottom of the pot. An 18-ounce package of rolled oats in South Philadelphia in 1960 cost about 22 cents. 1 serving of oatmeal with 1 small apple costs only about 8 to 12 cents, soft enough for breakfast, but in a 1-person house, warm enough for dinner too. She washed the apple in the enamel sink, kept the peel on if it was still firm, then cut it into pieces the size of a fingertip. When the water began to tremble, oats and apples were poured in. Cinnamon released its scent slowly, and brown sugar melted into a quiet sweetness. After 10 to 15 minutes, the spoon left a short trail as it passed through, and the porridge closed over again. The remaining portion was covered with a small plate. The next morning, she added a little water, set it back over low heat, and the smell of cinnamon called the kitchen awake. Dish number 22. Potatoes and leeks cooked soft potatoes broke under the back of the spoon, making the liquid in the pot smooth without any need for milk or cream. In 1960, potatoes in South Philadelphia cost about 6 to 7 cents per pound. Leeks were more expensive than yellow onions, so on many days she used an onion instead. 2 pounds of potatoes, 1 leek or 1 onion, and a small pat of butter made a pot of soup for about 25 to 35 cents. She pulled a chair close to the table and sat down while peeling the potatoes with a small knife. The leek was split lengthwise, and each layer washed clean of sand, then sliced into rounds. Everything went into the pot with just enough water to cover it, along with salt and butter. After about 30 minutes, she pressed part of the potatoes against the side of the pot, then stirred them back in so the liquid would thicken naturally. The first bowl was eaten with a slice of stale bread. The next day, the soup was thicker. The little water added, it became soft again. Those hands knew how to reduce the work and still keep the meal. In the South Philadelphia house, the first 4 dishes were cooked with more arranging than strength. A chair near the table, a light pot, 1 portion left for tomorrow. The recipe box remained open, and to the west, the factory whistle and Youngstown's cast iron skillet were waiting. Potatoes, onions, and the cast iron skillet after the quitting time whistle. In 1960, in Youngstown, Ohio, her small house stood a few blocks from the steel mill. Evening came down slowly, the shift change whistle echoed over the rooftops, and the red glow from the blast furnace sometimes still flashed against the window pane like a streak of coal that had not gone out. As her husband used to come home after the night shift, his collar dusted with gray, his lunch pail set down on the kitchen chair. That coat was no longer hanging behind the door, but the cast iron skillet still lay in its old place. In the recipe box, many cards still listed 6 servings. She took a pencil, crossed out the number 6, and wrote the number 2 very small beside it. The family recipe was reduced, like the table with fewer chairs, like the soup pot with less water, but the smell of onion meeting hot fat still recognized its own kitchen. Dish number 21. Pan-fried potatoes with onion. The sound of the first potato slice touching the hot fat rang out dry and clean, just as the factory whistle faded at the end of the street. In 1960, in Youngstown, a pound of potatoes cost about 6 to 7 cents, and lard cost about 20 cents a pound. With 1 pound of potatoes, half an onion, and 1 spoonful of fat, she had a skillet of food for around 10 to 15 cents. She washed the potatoes under cold running water, kept the thin skins on, then sliced them into pieces nearly the same thickness. The fat heated in the cast iron skillet, the surface of the pan shone lightly as if it had been polished. The potatoes went down first, the onion was scattered over them afterward, and then the heavy lid was set on top, so the centers could slowly soften. Once the steam had done its first work, she lifted the lid and let the faces of the potatoes press close against the iron. She turned the potatoes when the lower edges had turned brown, because stirring too soon would break the slices apart. The smell of onion clung to the wool sweater hanging by the door. The next morning, what was left often went with an egg. Hands remembered the rhythm of the stove before the clock did. Dish number 20, stewed potatoes and cabbage. The cabbage sent up a warm, lightly sharp smell with the steam, while the potatoes at the bottom of the pot began to break at the corners each time they were stirred. In that same year of 1960, potatoes were still about 6 to 7 cents a pound, and cabbage was about 8 cents a pound. 1 pound of cabbage, half an onion, and a small piece of butter made a pot of food for less than 30 cents. Cut the potatoes into small chunks so they would soften evenly. The cabbage was stripped of its outer leaves, its hard core removed, then divided into rough pieces, just small enough to sit neatly in the pot. The potatoes and onion went to the bottom first, with just enough water to cover them. After about 15 minutes, the cabbage was pressed on top. The lid held the heat in, so the leaves would soften, but still keep their shape. Near the end, she stirred hard a few times, letting the broken potatoes blend into the liquid and thicken the dish. In earlier days, the pot had been larger, and there had been more bowls. In 1960, half a head of cabbage was still enough to make the kitchen smell like a real meal. That smell stayed. Dish number 19, small white bean soup with smoked bacon. Since the night before, the beans had been lying in the deep enamel bowl, quietly taking in water overnight. By morning, she picked through them once more, poured off the soaking water, and put the beans into the pot with onion, celery, and a strip of smoked bacon. In Youngstown in 1960, dried white beans cost about 16 to 17 cents a pound, and smoked bacon cost about 80 to 90 cents a pound. But the whole pot needed only a quarter pound. A small pot costing around 40 to 55 cents could carry her through 3 or 4 meals. When the water boiled, she skimmed the foam from the surface, lowered the heat, and let the pot speak for itself in a very low, bubbling voice. After many hours, the bean skins began to split. The clear water turned cloudy white. The smell of smoke drifted slowly through the kitchen curtain. She pressed some of the beans against the side of the pot to make the broth thicker, chopped the meat small, then returned it to the pot. Salt was added last. On the first day it was still thin, on the second day thicker, and on the third day spooned over toast. There was still enough for the day after. Dish number 18, American-style beef and tomato macaroni overnight. Macaroni absorbed the red sauce, becoming softer and more fragrant. When the container was opened at lunch the next day, the tomatoes and beef had blended into the familiar smell of working homes. In 1960, Youngstown, ground beef cost about 52 cents a pound, dry macaroni cost about 23 cents a pound, and canned tomatoes cost about 16 cents. Half a pound of meat, half a pound of macaroni, and 1 can of tomatoes made a pot of food for about 50 to 65 cents. She heated the pot, used the tip of the spoon to break the meat into small bits, then stirred until the edges of the meat began to brown. Excess fat was poured off. Onion, crushed tomatoes, dry macaroni, and water went straight into the same pot. The second pot and the colander for rinsing the macaroni stayed still on the shelf. She covered the pot, lowered the heat, then scraped and stirred along the bottom a few times over about 20 minutes. The macaroni cooked right in the sauce, swelling soft and holding on to the taste of the meat. She let it cool, divided it into 3 portions, 1 portion for tonight and 2 portions for the days after. The next day it was even deeper in flavor. Youngstown's cast-iron skillet had once waited for a man to come home after his shift. Later it stayed with the woman who still wiped the table, browned potatoes, stewed beans, and divided meals into small bowls. The recipes had grown smaller. The way of living remained whole. Dried beans, meat smoke, and the pot that did not run dory. In 1953, in Harlan County, Kentucky, her wooden house still had traces of dried mud near the door, where miners' shoes had once been lined up after a long day. Meat counter in town had prettier cuts, thicker cuts easier to bring to the table, but her basket often took ham hocks, chicken necks, chicken backs, and a few slices of salt pork wrapped in wax paper. Those parts needed low heat, a deep pot, and someone patient enough to wait for the smoke and bone broth to travel their full distance. Dish number 17, potato beans stewed with smoked ham hock. The smell of smoke came out of the pot before the lid was even lifted. Among the soft beans, the ham hock lay still, its meat already leaving the bone with only a light touch of the spoon. 1953, in Harlan County, dried white beans cost about 17 cents per pound, while ham hocks and bone pieces were often much cheaper than a whole piece of ham. 1 pound of beans with one small ham hock could become a 45 to 60-cent pot, enough for 4 or 5 servings. The night before, she poured the beans onto the table, picked out grit with her fingertips, and rinsed them through several changes of water. The next morning, fresh water was put into the pot, the ham hock set in the middle of the beans, with onion and bay leaf around it, like things meant to hold the scent. When foam rose, she skimmed the surface clean, lowered the heat, and let the pot murmur for 3 hours. By the time the meat was tender, she pulled off each small piece and returned it to the pot, while the bone was set aside, having almost finished all its work. The first day was soup, the second day it thickened, the third day it was ladled over cornbread. The bone had done all its work. Dish number 16. The cornmeal porridge with salt pork fat from the pieces of salt pork melted slowly at the bottom of the pot, leaving a thin shine on the surface of the yellow porridge. When the spoon passed through, the porridge closed back slowly, thick and warm like a small blanket for the kitchen. In 1953, cornmeal in Harlan County cost about 11 to 13 cents per pound. Salt pork was more expensive, so she cut it very thin, just enough for 1 cup of cornmeal to become a 15 to 25-cent pot. She sliced the meat into small pieces, put them into a heavy pot, and rendered them slowly so the fat would run out, while the meat still kept its salty taste. Water meeting hot fat made a low sizzle. When the surface of the water began to tremble, the cornmeal was sprinkled down in a thin stream, while her other hand stirred steadily so the meal would dissolve into the water. The heat was lowered, the spoon moved in circles close to the bottom until the porridge turned smooth. What remained was poured into a tray, spread flat, and left to cool overnight. The next morning, cut it into slices and set them back in the pan until the edges turned lightly golden. 1 pot turned into 2 meals, and every part found its own use. Dish number 15. Chicken back and neck soup. Chicken bones tapped lightly against the side of the pot while the water was still cold. Then the kitchen slowly took on the smell of onion, celery, and the thin layer of chicken skin, releasing its flavor into the water. In 1953, dressed chicken cost about 54 cents per pound, but backs, necks, and wingtips were often priced lower because they had little meat. 1 pound of bones with a little vegetable could become a pot of soup for under 40 cents. She placed the chicken backs and necks in cold water, adding carrot, onion, and celery cut into large pieces so they would be easy to lift out. The pot warmed slowly. When white foam rose to the surface, she used a spoon to skim it away bit by bit, as though she were clearing the whole meal. After nearly 2 hours, the bones were lifted onto an enamel plate. She waited for them to cool, used her fingertips to pull the small bits of meat from around the joints, then returned them to the pot. A handful of rice was added at the end to make the bowl of soup fuller. 1 bowl to eat right away, 1 bowl for tomorrow, 1 portion for the day when her body was tired. Small parts could still feed a person. Dish number 14. Chicken with steamed dumplings. Steam lifted the heavy lid very gently. Underneath, the pieces of dough were swelling on the surface of the chicken broth, soft on the outside and still holding warmth at the center. Also in Harlan County in 1953, dressed chicken cost about 54 cents per pound, flour about 10 cents per pound, and lard about 34 cents. Backs, necks, and bony wings were used. This pot cost much less than a whole chicken. She stewed the chicken with onion, celery, water, and salt until the meat left the bone. The meat was removed, shredded, and returned to the pale yellow broth. Flour, lard, salt, and a little water were mixed just enough to form a soft mass. She used a spoon to scoop up portions of dough, dropped them onto the surface of the gently boiling liquid, and covered the pot tightly for 20 minutes, so the steam could make the last of the dough rise. That dish had once been carried to homes with someone ill, homes with a new mother, homes that needed a hot pot to get through a long day. In 1953, she cooked a smaller pot for herself. The caregiver was still here. In Harlan County, bones, fat, and cornmeal had never been lowly parts. There were things that knew how to answer low heat and time. She set the pot lid down, wiped the table clean, then let the kitchen keep for itself the smell of smoke, the smell of meal, and the steam of a day that had been used to its very end, cornmeal, hominy, and the things deep in the pantry. In 1960, in Muskogee, Oklahoma, the sound of freight trains still rolled through the neighborhood after dark. That sound passed through the wooden walls, through the kitchen door, then faded little by little like an old habit. She lived in a house where her husband had once worked near the railroad line. He was gone, but the pantry was still arranged the way it had been in earlier days. Beans on the lower shelf, corn kernels and canned tomatoes in the middle, barley in a glass jar at the back. When the recipe box was opened, a few dry barley grains fell from one card. On the back, there was a faint pencil line. Use the vegetables before they spoil. The dishes in Muskogee began with the ability to look beyond the dinner sitting right in front of her. Dish number 13, toe beans stewed with tomatoes. The smell of onion and chili powder escaped through the gap in the lid just as the distant train changed tracks, creating a long metallic sound in the dark. In 1960, in Muskogee, dried beans cost about 16 to 17 cents a pound, and canned tomatoes cost about 16 cents. With 1 pound of beans, 1 can of tomatoes, a little onion, fat, and seasoning, she had a pot of stew for about 40 cents. The beans were soaked the night before, then rinsed the next morning again until the water was clearer. She heated a spoonful of fat at the bottom of the pot, stirred the onion until it turned translucent and soft, then added the beans, tomatoes, water, chili powder, and aromatic seeds. The pot simmered gently for 2 to 3 hours, long enough for the pinto beans to soften gradually and for the liquid to turn a deep red. Near the end, she mashed a ladleful of beans against the side of the pot, then stirred them back in so the starch would thicken the stew. That dish could go with cornbread, rice, or stand on its own in an enamel bowl. A pot of beans knew how to wait until the end of the week. Dish number 12, hominy stewed with ham. The can lid popped open with a dry, short, familiar sound. The large white kernels slid into the colander, carrying the light smell of brine before they met the ham fat in the pot. In Muskogee in 1960, a can of hominy cost about 15 to 20 cents. Smoked ham averaged about 60 cents a pound, but she used only a small piece, enough to keep the whole pot at around 30 to 40 cents. She rinsed some of the brine from the corn kernels, diced the ham, cut the onion small, and put the meat into the pot first. When the fat began to heat and release its smell, the onion was stirred in until soft, and then the hominy and a little broth were added. The pot simmered for about 30 minutes. The kernels absorbed the taste of the meat, and the liquid reduced little by little, clinging around each kernel like a thin coat. On days when her hands were stiff or her back was tired, the can of hominy on the high shelf was a quiet promise. It waited until it was needed. Dish number 11, vegetable and barley soup. 1 carrot had gone soft at the end, half an onion was still wrapped in paper, and 2 celery stalks bent downward in the cooler drawer. She set everything on the table before any of it had time to spoil. In 1960, potatoes in Muskogee cost about 6 to 7 cents a pound, canned tomatoes about 16 cents, and pearl barley was counted at 15 to 20 cents a pound. A pot of vegetable and barley soup usually came to about 25 to 35 cents. She rinsed the barley and dropped it into the leftover broth. Potatoes, carrots, onion, and celery were cut small, with the firm ingredients going in first and the tomatoes and softer vegetables added later. The pot stayed at a gentle simmer for more than an hour. The barley swelled round, the potatoes broke slightly at the edges, and the broth went from clear to a little cloudy and thick. She tasted it again before adding salt because old broth had a memory of its own. This dish changed from one weekend to the next, but whatever was left always had a place. Dish number 10, lentils stewed with tomatoes. The garlic warmed in the fat before the tomatoes were poured in, making the kitchen fill with aroma faster than the lentils needed time to soften. In 1960, the average price of dried beans in Muskogee was about 16 to 17 cents a pound, used as the reference point for lentils. With 1 cup of lentils, 1 can of tomatoes, onion, and garlic, she had a pot for about 25 to 35 cents. She poured the lentils onto a plate, picked out any grit, then rinsed them under cold water. The onion and garlic were softened in a spoonful of fat. The tomatoes, lentils, water, and seasoning went in all at once. After only 30 to 40 minutes, the lentils had already begun to thicken the stew. If there was a handful of leafy greens left, she tore it small and folded it into the pot during the final minutes. This was the dish for the day she forgot to prepare ahead, the day she opened the pantry late, the day she still needed a hot bowl before the kitchen light went out. Even a forgotten day, he still had a meal. Dish number 9. Black-eyed peas cooked with greens. The dark vegetable broth clung to the surface of the spoon, while the black-eyed peas still kept their shape after many hours on the fire. A small piece of smoked meat lay at the bottom of the pot, sending its smell into each strip of leaves. In 1960, dried beans cost about 16 to 17 cents a pound, used as the reference point for black-eyed peas. A bunch of greens and a small piece of smoked meat brought the pot to about 35 to 50 cents, enough for 4 to 5 small portions. She picked through the peas, rinsed them, then soaked them. The greens were stripped from their tough stems, washed several times to remove the dirt, stacked, rolled, and cut into strips. The peas were cooked first with onion and smoked meat. When the peas were nearly soft, the greens were pressed down into the pot, the lid was set on, and the heat was lowered so the leaves could soften and the broth could turn deep in color. The pot liquor was saved to spoon over cornbread or rice. In one bowl there were peas, greens, smoke, and broth that had simmered for many hours. The whole meal was in the pot. In the pantry in Muskogee, the beans, the can of hominy, the tomatoes, and the jar of barley sat quietly until the day she needed them. They helped her get through rain, through an aching back, through evenings when freight trains still howled in the distance. When the flame was lowered, the kitchen knew how to carry on with the rest of the work. Greens, beans, and pots that do their own work. In 1960, on the south side of Milwaukee, the winter wind slipped through the cracks around the door and made the kitchen curtain move gently in the late light. She kept cabbage in the refrigerator drawer, smoked sausage wrapped in wax paper, and a few cans of salmon on the high shelf beside the salt jar. The dishes she chose for the cold season had to be hot enough to warm the hands, but filling enough to get through a long evening, and sturdy enough that when reheated the next day, they still carried the smell of the meal before. Dish number 8. Cabbage steamed with smoked sork sausage fat floated in small rings on the surface of the broth, while the cabbage softened layer by layer, changing from its first sharp smell into a gentle sweetness in the heat. In 1960, in Milwaukee, cabbage cost about 8 cents per pound, and common sausage cost about 55 to 60 cents per pound. With half a pound of sausage and 1 small head of cabbage, she had a pot for about 40 cents. She removed the outer leaves, cut out the core, and then divided the cabbage into large pieces. The sausage was sliced into thick rounds so it would hold its shape while stewing. The first rounds touched the bottom of the pot, releasing the smell of smoke, garlic, and hot fat. Onion went in next, softening slowly in that fat. Then cabbage, water, and a pinch of aromatic seeds were placed on top. After 45 minutes over low heat, the window glass turned white with steam, and the broth grew deeper. The next day, she reheated it very slowly and ate it with a slice of dark bread. The window was covered with steam again. Dish number 7. Spillet pea soup with 4. The peas gradually broke apart in the pot, thickening the dark green surface of the soup until the mark from the spoon stayed there for a moment before closing. The price of dried beans in Milwaukee in 1960 was about 16 to 17 cents per pound, used as a guide for split peas, with another half pound of sausage priced at about 55 to 60 cents per pound. The whole pot came to about 50 to 60 cents. She rinsed the peas well, cut the onion small, sliced the sausage into rounds, then put everything into the pot with water and a bay leaf. Over about 1 hour, the peas dissolved on their own, their starch blending into the water, sausage fat entering each ladleful of soup instead of floating separately on the surface. Near the end, she stirred close to the bottom so the thick peas would not cling to the enamel pot. After one night, the soup was even thicker. Add water, and it became soup again. Leave it as it was, and it could be eaten like porridge with bread. Smoke made the bowl heavier. Dish number 6, dreed spillet pea porridge. Outside the window, snow was pushed sideways by the wind through the streetlight. In the kitchen, the pot trembled very slightly, as if breathing under the lid. Split peas, calculated at the 1960 price of 16 to 17 cents per pound, went with 1 strip of salt pork and an onion to make a pot of porridge for about 35 to 45 cents. She poured the peas into a basket, checked for grit, then rinsed them under cold water. The peas, onion, water, and strip of salt pork all went into one pot. When the water boiled, the heat was lowered to its lowest setting. After about 1 hour, each pea had nearly disappeared, leaving behind a thick, smooth green porridge. She stirred the bottom, added water when needed, then pulled a chair closer to the heater and rested her feet for a little while. This dish allowed the cook to step away from the stove for short stretches and still return in time. It forgave tiredness. Dish number 5, canned salmon milk. Soap milk was poured in a white stream into the pot of potatoes, carrying with it the smell of butter, soft onion, and the light saltiness of salmon. In 1960, in Milwaukee, one 16-ounce can of pink salmon cost about 66 to 67 cents. Milk costs about 25 cents per liter, and potatoes about 6 to 7 cents per pound. A small pot came to about 85 cents to $1, enough for 4 generous servings. She diced the potatoes so they would cook quickly, softened the onion with butter at the bottom of the pot, then added potatoes, water, and salt. When the potatoes were nearly tender, the salmon was poured in along with the liquid from the can. The small fish bones were gently crushed under the tip of a fork, dissolving into the soup instead of being pushed aside. The milk went in at the end, and the pot was kept at a gentle heat so the liquid would stay smooth. She divided it into 4 bowls, each one holding salmon, potatoes, and a thick layer of milk that kept the warmth longer. Goken a long way. 4 dishes in Milwaukee were cooked to carry a person through cold and time. They grew thicker on the second day, held their shape after each reheating, and made the kitchen smell as if someone were still waiting for a meal. At the bottom of the recipe box, 4 softer cards lay still. They belonged to a kitchen in Chicago, chicken bones, canned fish, and broth pots that hold in the warmth in 1953. On the south side of Chicago, she opened the recipe box on the table covered with a checkered cloth. The wood of the box had darkened along the edges, and inside were cards that carried many different kitchens with them. 1 red beans card from Louisiana, 1 chicken and rice card rewritten after the war, 1 sheet of paper that only said stew with the number 1933 in the corner. And at the bottom, a chicken soup card with a pale broth stain that had dried long ago. She placed the small pot behind the box, then went through each card with her fingers. The number 6 had been crossed out in pencil. Beside it, number 2 was written smaller, as if the writer were afraid of disturbing an old memory. 1 corner of a card held a tomato stain, 1 edge of paper had softened from steam, and 1 place had been set beneath the kitchen light. She kept the smell of onion, the way to skim foam, and the time for rice to rest under the lid. The portions, but her hands still remembered the right rhythm. The last 4 cards told why the stove was still lit, even when only 1 person was left to sit down at the table. Saw cabbage and Industrial City Super's dish number 4. Red beans, cooked with rice Monday morning on the south side of Chicago in 1953, began with the sound of a wash basin being pulled softly across the floor and the smell of beans that had soaked overnight in the kitchen. The family had once carried this dish north from Louisiana, through train rides, rented rooms, and winters nothing like home. In the new house, Monday was still red bean day. Dried beans then cost about 17 cents per pound, while rice was about 19 to 20 cents per pound. If there was a leftover ham bone, 1 pound of beans could become a 35 to 50-cent pot, enough to keep the kitchen warm for many hours. She chopped the onion, celery, and green bell pepper small, then let them soften slowly in a spoonful of fat. The smell of the vegetables rose before the beans, ham bone, water, and bay leaf were added. The pot was kept at a low simmer. Outside, the city passed by in the sound of cars and cold wind, while in the kitchen, the beans softened little by little. Near the end, she mashed some of the beans against the side of the pot so the liquid would thicken. The rice was cooked separately in the small pot, or the portion left from the day before's was used. When the beans were ladled over it, the bowl carried an old place with it, a kitchen carrying home. Dish number 3, the chicken thick check cooked with rice. The chicken skin touched the bottom of the pot and gave off a very soft sizzle, the kind of sound that was enough to give rhythm to a quiet kitchen. In 1953, in the south side of Chicago, dressed chicken cost about 54 cents per pound, and rice about 20 cents per pound. 2 chicken thighs, 1 cup of rice, and an onion could make a 60 to 75-cent pot, filling enough while still within reach. She patted the chicken thighs dry, sprinkled them with salt, then placed them skin side down in the hot pot. Fat from the dark meat ran out, glossing the bottom of the pot before the meat was lifted out for the moment. Onion and rice were stirred in that fat, each grain of rice beginning to turn clearer at the edges. Broth was poured in, 2 chicken thighs were set back on top of the rice, and then the heavy lid came down. For about 30 minutes, she let the pot hold on to its own heat. The rice absorbed the broth, the chicken fat, the smell of onion right under the lid. The next day, the rice at the bottom of the pot was reheated with a spoonful of water, softening again while still carrying the smell of the evening before. That familiarity was a form of reassurance. The lid held everything in. The first 2 dishes from the Chicago kitchen held on to place and habit. The last 2 cards lay deeper in the recipe box. 1 card marked 1933, 1 card carrying a broth stain that had faded in color. They led back to difficult years and to a pot of broth once cooked for anyone who needed care. Bean porridge, stews, the last pots still waiting on the stove. Dish number 2. Stew from the 1930. The card lay near the bottom of the recipe box, its edges darkened from once being too close to the stove. On it, she had written only the word stew, 4 ingredients, and the number 1933 in the corner. In 1953, on the south side of Chicago, she still cooked that dish again, even though the Great Depression had receded 20 years into the past. At the prices then, a small amount of ground beef, potatoes, corn, and tomatoes could make a pot for about 45 to 60 cents. She heated the pot, but used a spoon to break the beef into small crumbles, then stirred until the edges began to brown. The sound of the meat touching the bottom of the pot was dry and short, like the sound of a meal being stretched with care. Its water was added afterward. Diced potatoes, corn, and tomatoes fell in one after another, making the liquid turn brighter in color. Salt and pepper were enough. After about 45 minutes, the potatoes were soft. She mashed a few pieces into the broth so the dish would thicken naturally. Each bowl received a little meat, a little corn, and plenty of potatoes. The name of the dish did not matter. What mattered was that the bowl was hot enough, full enough, and still remembered the way hard years had once taught people to divide everything just right. Dish number 1, chicken soup. The final card had a pale broth stain in the corner. It stood at the top of the list because chicken soup was an act many working American kitchens understood. Place chicken in a pot, add onion, celery, and carrots, lower the heat, and wait for the broth to turn clear gold. In a house of 1 person, that act still kept its old meaning. The person standing by the stove and the person who needed care had become the same person. 1953, on the south side of Chicago, ready-to-cook chicken averaged about 54 cents a pound. One 3-pound chicken with onion, carrots, and celery made a pot for about $1.70 to $1.80. She placed the whole chicken into a deep pot, cut the carrots into chunks, broke the celery in half, and quartered the onion. The clean onion skin was kept so the broth would have a deeper color. Cold water covered the chicken, salt was sprinkled lightly, and then the pot was brought to the fire slowly. When foam rose, she skimmed it away by the spoonful so the surface of the broth gradually cleared. For nearly 2 hours, the smell of onion, celery, and chicken skin moved through the hallway, touched the curtains, and clung to the tablecloth already set out. The chicken was lifted out, the meat pulled from the bone, ND divided into several portions. One portion went back into the soup, the rest was saved for sandwiches or the next day's meal. The bowl was filled and placed in its proper spot on the table. The kitchen was still bright. At the end, she dried her hands, placed the chicken soup card back at the bottom of the recipe box, where Louisiana, the year 1933, family meals, and one final pot of broth still lay beside one another. 25 dishes have passed through working American kitchens, from the can of tomatoes in South Philadelphia, the potato pan in Youngstown, the ham hock in the bean pot in Kentucky, the kernels of corn deep in the cupboard in Oklahoma, the winter cabbage in Milwaukee, and then stopping beside the chicken soup pot in Chicago. Each dish began with something ordinary: a bag of beans, a potato, a bone, a tin can, 2 eggs. Through the hands of those women, they became a hot supper, tomorrow's lunch, and a way to keep the kitchen carrying the warmth of human presence. The table that had once been set for 6 now held one place setting. The chicken soup card was placed back at the bottom of the recipe box, right beneath the 6s crossed out into 2s. The corner of the paper still held a pale broth stain, and the pencil line from 1953 had almost dissolved into the color of the old paper. On the stove, the enamel pot slowly cooled. Steam left the window glass. Outside the window, the house had gone dark, but the kitchen light remained. If your family once had a one-pot dish like that, leave the name of the dish below. If you want to keep opening the old cards of Old American Kitchen, subscribe to the channel. Another kitchen is still waiting.